Failbetter Games has always had this wildly fantastic streak in their games writing. Failbetter's worlds have always felt so alive and unique compared to even some novels' universes, filled with a patchwork quilt of vibrant stories almost 70% composed of world building to create foreign but stunningly realized worlds that suck you in. This has always been their calling card, but Sunless Skies' world of steam locomotive airships trades a bit of that instantly arresting culture shock for tweaked gameplay that's far more interesting than its predecessors. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're sailing the forlorn skies of the Reach in Sunless Skies. One quick thing before we get into the meat of this. I requested, and did receive, a free press copy of this game, so a big thank you to Failbetter Games, and a heads up for everyone else watching. As for the game itself, if you've played Sunless Sea, you pretty much already know what you're getting into with this one. Failbetter has a few new tricks up their sleeve with Skies, but unsurprisingly, this is still fundamentally the same game at heart. But for those not familiar with Failbetter's MO, the Sunless games, and their predecessor Fallen London, are horror stories that oscillate between the gothic and the Lovecraftian varieties. This is a world where time and your own soul are harvestable, consumable trade goods, where devils operate in broad daylight and your first job is to take a sealed coffin with unknown contents across the sky. But it's also a world where suns are all-powerful living beings beyond our comprehension. Gargantuan horrors lurk just below, and cannibal cults claim the fringes of civilization. As an actual game, Sunless Skies basically plays like a choose-your-own-adventure novel with some simple economic market manipulation on the side. It can all be divided into 3 parts. When you get started, you'll be a lot more focused on the economic concerns of just finding the next port before you run out of food and starve to death. And your routes will mostly be decided by where you can find goods to buy for cheap than where to take them to sell at a premium. Then comes the exploration phase, when you establish yourself well enough to break into unknown territory and start seeing what's actually out there in the world. You pick up a bunch of plot hooks for each new island and see a lot of cool world building as you learn the lay of the land. And then, finally, you get into the heavy narrative bits when you've leveled up your skills enough to start pursuing storylines to their actual completion and strike out to locations for primarily story-focused reasons. Compared to its predecessor, Sunless Skies has added a number of little tweaks that liven up its gameplay. Planning your trips is made a bit more interesting by randomized delivery requests you can accept so you don't end up just grinding the same trade route over and over again. Combat has introduced a dodge, so you've got something more interesting to do than just drive in circles mashing the attack button, and navigation is complicated by one-directional drafts of wind and monuments that affect your crew's morale for good or ill. They're all small tweaks, but they do a lot to improve the series' weaker elements by adding some variety to the game's proceedings. There is one elephant in the room that needs to be mentioned, however, and that's the travel time. The Sunless games have a lot of downtime. Like 5 minutes of travel between ports with only 1 or 2 things along the way downtime. One might think all this downtime unnecessary padding, but in Sunless Sea it was a vital part of the game, both required to make good on the mechanical side of its gameplay by giving you a meaningful distance to have to manage your crew, fuel, supplies, and sanity across, and to set the lonely, foreboding tone that the Z exuded that was such a big part of the game's atmosphere. Except there's just one thing that kind of undercuts half that design decision's purpose. Unlike Sunless Sea, Sunless Skies just isn't all that foreboding. The Reach feels less like a dreary hellscape where mystery and a fate worse than death lies around every corner, and more like a British-run African colony, complete with jungle safaris, a gold rush, and an ongoing war for independence against London. And I want to be absolutely clear, this shift in tone is not a knock against the game. The writing is just as good as it's ever been, and I'm still really enjoying it. But the subject matter trends more towards adventure novel than horror story. It's not nearly as oppressive and mysterious as Failbetter's previous outings, and so the slow burn horror of Sunless Sea's voyages through the dark unknown are, well, not as dark, and therefore don't leave me as on edge. And without that tense feeling of wondering if I'll actually make it to the next port, all that's left is the mechanical Eurotruck simulator aspect of managing your crew and fuel from port to port. And I think a big part of this just comes down to scale. Sunless Sea only had a single region for you to explore, meaning the amount of time it took you to start bumping into the game's bizarre and horrific locations was shorter. Sunless Skies features 4 full regions of seemingly comparable size, and the reach where you start very much feels like a starter zone of sorts. The most unsettling thing I brushed into was a friendly revenge cult living in a whirlpool. If you just take a glance at any of Sunless Skies' trailers, there's clearly horror aplenty to experience, but in my first 5 hours, I didn't find much of it. Which conveniently brings me to the most pressing question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Sunless Skies? And frankly, it's only enough to get your toes wet. 5 hours will probably be enough to tell you if you're on board with Failbetter's particular brand of storytelling, but it won't be nearly enough to get a complete experience out of the game. If you remember how I described this game as being divided into 3 distinct parts, I'm still very much in that second exploration phase, holding on to the very start of several plot threads, but only really having seen 1 or 2 short beginner missions to completion. That said, I for one am really picking up what Failbetter's putting down, and while it might not be pulling me in quite as well as its predecessor, Sunless Skies' writing is still more than enough to be called engrossing, and this time around the writing actually has some interesting gameplay to stitch it together. But ultimately, Sunless Skies is more of the same out of Failbetter, and that means if you like their old stuff, you'll like this. It's hard to recommend this game if you've only got a few hours to spend with it, but if it does take over your life, like it's slowly taking over mine, you'll at least have an enjoyable time getting possessed. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this first 5 review. If you did, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. If you're looking for games that value your time and don't pad themselves, I'm your guy. And be sure to check out some of my other reviews or some longer form content while you're here. But regardless, thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.